Hi, kids, back with you. We're on chapter 13. Make sure you have writing utensils and your spiral or your notebook paper, and we will get started. Lockout is the name of chapter 13. By the middle of third period, Greg had put the whole incident with Mara and Eileen and Brittany out of his mind. Gym class had helped. They had a great soccer game out on the big field, and he'd been the left forward. Good for 2 goals. Plus, he'd sold 7 more copies of his comic book, and now the whole language arts class was having a big argument about which was better, Holes the book or Holes the movie. Life was back to normal. Then the intercom speaker next to the clock on the wall crackled to life. Kind of personification, don't you think? It was Mr. Ogden, the school secretary. Mrs. Lindell. The teacher held up her hand for quiet. Yes? All eyes swung to the speaker as if there were something to see. Pardon the interruption. Will you please send Gregory Kenton to the office? Mrs. Lindell nodded at the speaker and said, He'll be right there. Then she nodded at Greg. When the secretary said his name, Greg had felt his stomach tighten, felt a tingle in his mouth and across the top of his scalp. But he pushed back the fear, stood up, and walked out the door into the hallway. The hall was empty, quiet. His cross trainers squeaked on the tiles as he walked. And by his cross trainers, they mean his shoes. Like his sneakers, tennis shoes. Greg told himself, could be a message from my mom, like maybe a dentist appointment after school, so I don't take the bus home. But Greg knew he was kidding himself. This had to be about something else. And when he turned the last corner and looked through the office windows, he knew. Mara was sitting on the little wooden bench on the side of the principal's door, and Mr. Z sat in the chair on the other side. So this was going to be about what had happened yesterday, about arguing and yelling in math class, about getting whacked in the nose, because fighting of any kind was absolutely forbidden at Ashworth Intermediate. A huge no-no, right up there with vandalism and stealing. And Mrs. Davenport came down hard on fighting. Always. When Greg entered the office, Mrs. Ogden looked up and then pointed at the bench. Greg sat down. Without turning her head, Mara whispered, This is your fault. I have never been called to the principal's office before. Greg snortled and whispered back, Well, boo-hoo. We didn't even fight. It was an accident. We can prove it. So relax. We're just going to get yelled at a little bit. Or suspended, Mara said. The principal's door opened. Mr. Xanatopoulos, Mara, Greg, please come in. Sit down. She pointed, and Greg and Mara took the chairs in the front of her desk, and Mr. Z sat off to the right a few feet. Mrs. Davenport sat down. I've talked now with Mr. Z and also with the school nurse about what happened yesterday. I understand that Greg's knock on the nose was an accident, and I'm already ready to let it go at that. But I want both of you to know how serious I am about fighting. I will have none of that in this school, and I'm not going to have any angry, shouting, or arguments either, because that's almost the same. You two have a bad habit of not getting along. You both need to grow out of that. But until that happens, my direction is that you simply keep away from each other. And to help this happen, Greg, starting Monday, you will have Mr. Scully for first period social studies, and Mora at 6th period on Monday, you will report to Mrs. Toroni's level 4 math class. Any questions? Mora shook her head. Her face was pale. She wasn't going to say a thing. She felt lucky not to be suspended or expelled. After all, she was the one who had thrown that wicked right hook. Craig also shook his head. The new schedule was fine with him. In fact, it was great. The less he saw of Mora, the better. Mrs. Davenport looked from face to face and said, All right then, that's that. Greg put his hands on the arms of his chair, all set to stand up and leave. Now about this situation, the principal said, and she opened a folder. She held up a copy of Return of the Hunter in one hand and a copy of The Last Unicorn in the other. I saw these in Mr. Z's room yesterday afternoon, and he tells me that you two have been selling these little books around the school. Is that correct? I've been seeing them all over, especially this one. She shook the crayon comic. Talking fast, Mora pointed at the unicorn book and said, I only made 5 of mine, and I mostly gave them to my friends. I just sold 1, Mrs. Davenport said. Greg, what about you? He nodded at her other hand. I've been selling that one since Monday, and everybody likes it, really likes it, so I'm working on a whole series. Did you read it? Mrs. Davenport seemed surprised, both by Greg's chatty reply and by his question. She gave a halting nod, and Greg said, Did you like the story? The principal put a stern look on her face and said, We're not discussing the quality of your writing today. Do you remember the talk we had right here in my office last June? I told you I did not want you selling things at school. Do you remember that? Do you guys remember that at the beginning of the story when she said he couldn't sell things? Mm-hmm. Greg had an answer to her question, but he didn't speak up. Instead, he raised his hand. He was about to tell the principal she was wrong, so it seemed like a good idea to wait politely for her permission to speak. What do you think? When she nodded at him, Greg said, "Last June I was selling little toys, and you told me that I wasn't allowed to sell them at school, so I stopped right away, just like you said. And I'm not selling toys. I'm selling books." A student telling a principal she's mistaken? Well, that doesn't happen very often, and there's a good reason for that. Mrs. Davenport's eyes flashed, and with clipped words, what do you think clipped words means? Do you think she was speaking very politely and calmly, or she was mad? Yeah, I know perfectly well what you're selling. This is a comic book, and in my view, comic books are practically toys, and bad toys at that. This is hardly what I would call a book. When I first saw one of these on Monday, and I saw your name on it, I should have called you in here that instant and put a stop to it, because look what's happening now. Mrs. Davenport opened the folder again and picked up 4 or 5 other little handmade comic books. She fanned them out like playing cards and held them up for all to see. Greg could only see parts of the covers, but what he saw didn't look good, The artwork was crude and poorly drawn. And crude just means like not drawn very well, not very good quality. One cover showed an evil-looking muscle man holding a big knife, and the title was Just in Time to Dine. Another was the title Crundoom, and it showed a huge slobbering monster biting off the top of a girl's head. So that crude in that instance means like not right, not okay for school, right? Like blood and biting off heads. Yeah, we don't do that. After a pause to let the pictures sink in, the principal said, "Because of your example, everybody now seems to think they can make nasty, violent stuff like this and then bring it to school and sell it. That would be a problem." Greg put his hand up again, and this time he started speaking before the principal nodded at him. "But my comic's not like that. I mean, there's action in the story and things get sort of rough, but I wasn't trying to make it violent. It's history. I based it on real Stone Age people. I got books from the library." So here, Greg did his research. So remember we talked about narratives being made up stories. However, a lot of them are based on real events. So if you're writing a narrative, and you want to put information in there about something you kind of know about, a little bit about, but a lot of writers research things so that the information is accurate, even though the story is made up. Mrs. Davenport waved her hand. "I'm not going to have a discussion about which comic book is worse than the other. I'm going to say what I said to you last June, and this time, let me be clear. Do not sell things at school. Do not sell anything. School is a place for learning and thinking. It's not a place for buying and selling. Mr. Xenotopoulos, do you have anything to add?" The question caught Mr. Z off guard. Well, I was just going to say that I think it's important what you've said to Greg and Maura, and that's all. Mrs. Davenport stood up, as if there were strings connecting everyone. The other 3 people popped up too. "Very well then," the principal said. "We all understand one another, and I'll be making an all-school announcement during 6th grade lunch today so that everyone else understands too. Now let's all get back to work, our real work. This is a school day." And with that, the meeting ended. In the hall outside the office, Maura turned right and hurried toward the science rooms. Since his language arts class was in room 25, Greg turned left and walked alongside Mr. Z. Neither of them spoke. About halfway down the long hall, Greg wanted to ask Mr. Z a question. He held back, because the question seemed improper. Top of page 124. Too bold. But hadn't they both been knocked flat on their backs together, down into that bloody math room floor? And hadn't they discussed money and careers and the Xenotopoulos toilet theory? Didn't sharing that experience mean they were both sort of related now? Not exactly blood brothers, but something, right? So do you guys know what blood brothers are? If I could speak it correctly. Back in the day, we used to, when I was a kid, we would prick our fingers like with our best friends. And you probably shouldn't do this, but we pricked our fingers and then we put them together and we'd say, now we're blood brothers or blood sisters. And it's like something we did back in the day, and they did a long time ago for like best friends, even though you're not related. But please don't prick your finger and tell your parents that Mrs. Ball said it was okay, because I'll get yelled at. And so, relying on this odd feeling of kinship and hoping that Mr. Z wouldn't get offended, Greg worked up the nerve to ask his question. "Mr. Z, I was wondering, Do you really agree with Mrs. Davenport, with everything she said? Mr. Z hesitated half a second, and then nodding his head, he said, Mrs. Davenport is very logical. Kids can be scrounging around all day trying to make money at school. It's not the right place for that. But what she said about comic books, Greg asked. And my comic book. Do you think my comic book is nasty and violent? It took 6 steps along the hallway before Mr. Z had an answer to that one, almost to the door of room 25. Personally, I have nothing against comic books, and as a comic book, I didn't mind yours at all. It's actually quite good. But something to sell at school? No. Mrs. Davenport's right about that part. Greg went back to his desk in language arts class feeling a little better. At least Mr. Z wasn't lumping Creon in with those other comics. But the facts were still pretty discouraging. He wasn't going to be able to sell his comics at school. Sure, he could still write stories, still do his drawings, and still make all the comics he wanted to. And he could even try to sell them to kids some other way. But it would be so much harder. There didn't seem much point to it. School was where the kids were, and the kids were his readers, his customers. And it had to happen just when things were going so well, too. 14 more units, and he would have made his goal for the first week. 100 comics sold. It felt like another punch in the nose. Okay, so there's chapter 13. And I'm looking at my screen because I wrote down what I want you to write about. So pay attention. What do you think is a more upsetting problem to Greg? That he can't sell his comic books at school, or that the principal doesn't consider them comic books? And I want you to back it up with evidence that supports your answer from the story, from this chapter. So go back to this chapter and tell me what you think. It's your opinion, so there's no right or wrong, but you need to back it up with text evidence. Tell me what you think is more upsetting to Greg, that he can't sell his comic books at school, okay, and back up, tell me why the principal said he can't, or that the principal doesn't consider them to be comic books, okay, or consider them to be books, like normal books like you would learn from. So I hope you understand the writing prompt. I would say a paragraph. You're going to use examples from the text, so some of you might be longer. Again, just do it in your spiral. Again, what's the problem that's most upsetting to Greg? That he can't sell his comic books at school, or that the principal doesn't consider them actual books? And have fun with it. Use evidence from the story, and I will be back with you for chapter 14. I'm going to go bake some cookies for Mr. Ball. Love ya. Bye.